If this message speaks to you, don't just like it, pass it on. Share it directly with someone who needs to hear it, because messages like this don't always reach everyone they should. Thank you and enjoy. I have a question for you. Is reparations impossible? And before we go any further with this video, go ahead and put down in the comments whether you believe reparations is impossible or if it is possible, and tell me why. This is something that I would like to hear from you. Dr. John Henrik Clarke once said, "Powerful people cannot afford to educate the people they oppress, because once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power. You will take it." My grandfather told me this constantly. Power is in knowledge. And I want to give a thanks and a shout out to the YouTuber Cousin Rich for reminding me of things we often forget, the things many of us are taught at home because no school in America will teach this. Is reparations impossible? When people say reparations are impossible, they overlook something obvious. African Americans have already done things this country swore would never happen. Things declared illegal, unrealistic, dangerous, or unthinkable. Let's look at the receipts. Slavery in this country was called permanent. Politicians, courts, newspapers, and presidents promised it would last forever. But black people made slavery collapse. They resisted from the inside. They sabotaged the tools and slowed production. They escaped by the tens of thousands. They built information networks. They flocked to union lines and forced policy changes. They created the largest self-liberation in modern history. The archives back this up. The Freedmen's Bureau's records, slave narratives, union reports, military files. Slavery didn't end politely. It ended because black people pushed it over. Here's an example of what people called impossible and how black people made it real. In 1863, the United States Army said it was too risky to launch a deep strike raid into Confederate territory. White officers said the waterways were too narrow. They said the rice fields were too dangerous. They said the mission would fail. Harriet Tubman said, "Let me lead it." She worked with black scouts, men who had spent their lives on these rivers. She moved at night. She gathered intelligence no white officer could get. She mapped the channels by memory. And on June the 2nd, she led Union gunboats up the Combahee River. That night, 700 enslaved people walked off the plantation and boarded Union boats. Not one slaveholder could stop them. Not one Confederate patrol could block them. This was the largest single liberation of enslaved people in American history. It was led by a black woman the country said shouldn't read, shouldn't vote, and shouldn't lead anyone. The U.S. military called the raid impossible. Tubman and her scouts proved it wasn't. Impossible is just the name for a system you haven't pressured yet. Armed service was impossible. White generals claimed black men couldn't fight. The South said black soldiers would ruin the army. Instead, they helped save it. Nearly 200,000 fought. They held the line in brutal battles. They secured the Mississippi. They broke Confederate morale. the impossible became battlefield fact. Here's another example of what this country called impossible and how black people made it real. In 1863, the Union Army faced a crisis. Troops were exhausted, battles were dragging on, and defeat was on the table. White generals said recruiting black men was a bad idea. They said black soldiers wouldn't stand in a fight. They said they wouldn't follow orders. They said the army couldn't trust them with rifles. Then came the 54th Massachusetts. Men who had been barred from fighting their whole lives put on uniforms and marched straight towards one of the strongest Confederate forts in the coast. On July the 18th, they led the assault at Fort Wagner, a suicide mission by every measure. Cannons tore through the sand, bullets shredded the front line, smoke covered the beach. Half of the regiment was killed, wounded, or captured. But they didn't break. They didn't run. They held the line under the worst fire the Union Army had seen that summer. The moment changed everything. White officers watched from the rear, finally understood. They weren't questioning black ability. They were protecting white ego. After Fort Wagner, something shifted. Black men enlisted by the tens of thousands, not as laborers, as soldiers. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black troops and sailors served. They filled depleted regiments, they guarded supply lines, they fought in the Mississippi Valley. They turned the Union's manpower shortage into overwhelming strength, and the Confederacy knew it. Once black soldiers took the field, Southern defeat stopped being a question and became a countdown. Impossible collapses the moment black people touch it. They said literacy was impossible. Slave codes made literacy illegal. People said black children would never read on a large scale. 3 years after the war, thousands of schools existed. Black parents funded them. Black teachers filled the classrooms. Black children outran every expectation. Another impossible undone. Here's another example of something this country said black people would never do, and how they did it faster than anyone expected. Before the Civil War, teaching black people to read wasn't just discouraged, it was a crime. Slave codes made literacy illegal. White lawmakers said reading would make enslaved people dangerous and uncontrollable. They swore black children would never read on a large scale. They said the mind wasn't capable. Then freedom came, and black families showed what was really possible. In 1865, black parents in the South didn't wait for the government. They cleared out barns, they turned churches into classrooms, they built schools out of anything that could hold a roof. Some even taught under trees with slate boards carved out of river stone. Teachers came from everywhere. Formerly enslaved men and women who learned in secret, black soldiers returning from the war, northern black educators who traveled hundreds of miles. 3 years after the war, something happened the United States never predicted. More than 2,000 black schools existed across the South. Freedmen's Bureau agents wrote reports saying, "Children learn so fast, we can't keep enough books." Black students doubled and tripled the literacy gains that white leaders said were impossible. And the fear behind those old slave laws became obvious. Literacy wasn't a threat because black people might fail. It was a threat because black people succeeded. The country said black literacy would never happen. The black families built the largest grassroots educational movement in American history. Another impossible undone. Political power was impossible. Before the war, the idea of black elected officials was laughed at. By 1870, black men were rewriting state constitutions. 2 served in the U.S. Senate, 14 in the House, hundreds in state and local offices. These weren't symbolic roles. These were real seats of power. Impossible? Already done. Here's what political impossible looks like and how black people broke it. Before the Civil War, the idea of a black elected official wasn't taken seriously by anyone in power. White politicians laughed at it. Newspapers mocked it. Courts dismissed it as a fantasy. They said black people weren't ready, weren't capable, and weren't suited for public life. Then Reconstruction began, and black political leadership walked straight into the rooms built to exclude them. In 1868, across the South, black men were elected as delegates to rewrite entire state constitutions. Think about that. The same states that once sold their bodies were now forced to seat them as lawmakers. And they didn't sit quietly. They reshaped everything: public education, taxation, labor rights, court systems, and civil rights protections. In South Carolina's convention, black delegates held the majority. They authored some of the most progressive laws the South had ever seen. Then came Hiram Revels. In 1870, he took a seat in the United States Senate, the same seat once held by Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. A black man replaced the president of a slave nation. If that is not a definition of impossible, what is? By the end of Reconstruction, 2 black senators, 14 black congressmen, hundreds of black representatives, sheriffs, school board members, judges, and mayors across the South. These weren't honorary positions. These were real seats of power, casting votes, writing laws, drafting budgets, shaping policy. The country said black political power was absurd. Black people turned it into a governing class. Impossible? It was already done. They said economic power was impossible. People said formerly enslaved people could never run banks or towns, but they did. Freedmen built businesses, opened stores, formed mutual aid societies, and started thriving communities. Durham, Greenwood, Mound Bayou. Black economic life grew despite sabotage and violence. Another barrier shattered. Here's another thing this country swore black people could never do until they did it anyway. Right after the Civil War, white economists, politicians, and newspapers all said the same thing. Formerly enslaved people could never build wealth. They could never run businesses. They could never manage banks or towns. They said black people lacked the capacity for economic life. But as soon as freedom arrived, black communities stepped into one arena the country never wanted them in: ownership. In 1865, thousands of freed men and women walked into Freedmen's Savings Bank branches across the country. They opened accounts, they deposited wages, they saved for land, tools, businesses, and schools. The bank grew so fast, it had to open more than 30 branches in a few years. This wasn't charity, it was economic strategy. Then came the towns. In Mississippi, formerly enslaved people built Mound Bayou, a town founded, owned, and governed entirely by black residents. They built farms, they opened stores, they ran newspapers, they managed their own credit systems. White travelers wrote that entering Mound Bayou felt like entering a different country, a country where black freedom actually worked. In Durham, North Carolina, black entrepreneurs created an economic district so strong that white newspapers called it Black Wall Street of the South. Banks, insurance companies, factories, barbershops, publishing houses, all built and run by black men and women who had been enslaved a generation earlier. And in Greenwood, Oklahoma, black families built a community that produced millionaires just 50 years after slavery. Doctors, lawyers, real estate developers, merchants, restaurants, hotel, airstrips, all created in a country that said black prosperity was impossible. Greenwood wasn't a miracle, it was a blueprint. These communities faced sabotage, boycotts, arson, and violence. Some were wiped out. But the existence of the communities, the scale, the ambition, the planning, exposed the lie beneath every racist economic theory. The country said black financial power couldn't exist. Black communities built economic engines anyway. Another barrier shattered. They said desegregation was impossible. For a century, politicians said segregation would last forever. It didn't. Black students, parents, lawyers, pastors, and workers forced the system to break. They took on school boards, transit systems, employers, and state governments. Impossible? Done again. Here's another thing that this country swore would never happen, and how black people proved them wrong. For nearly a century, America promised segregation would last forever. Governors said it, school boards said it, Congress said it. They claimed the races couldn't mix. They said integration would destroy schools, cities, and the nation itself. Then black children and black parents stepped forward and exposed the lie. In Kansas, a black father named Oliver Brown walked his daughter Linda to a white school that refused to let her in. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He documented the denial and joined 12 other black families in a lawsuit that changed American law. Their case, Brown versus Board of Education, reached the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall argued it with a team of black lawyers who had trained for a decade for this moment. In 1954, the court ruled that segregation in public schools violated the Constitution. The barrier that seemed permanent cracked. But the ruling alone wasn't enough. White officials refused to follow it. Mobs formed, politicians dug in. Then came the Little Rock Nine. 9 teenagers who walked into Central High School in Arkansas knowing the state wanted them gone. White crowds screamed. Threats came daily. The governor tried to block the doors with the National Guard. So the president sent federal troops. The U.S. soldiers escorting black children to school because America couldn't follow its own laws. Those 9 children walked through hate with straight backs. Their courage shattered the myth of segregation's invincibility. And they weren't alone. Black workers staged sit-ins at lunch counters that had banned them for decades. Black students rode buses into cities where police promised violence. Black pastors, laborers, domestic workers, nurses, union leaders, they all took on systems designed to crush them. They pushed school boards, they sued employers, they challenged transit systems, they forced federal legislation. Every institution that said never was dragged into compliance. Segregation didn't fall because America grew a conscience. It fell because black people broke it. Impossible, done again. So again, I ask, is reparations impossible? Look at the pattern. Ending slavery was impossible. Black literacy was impossible. Black political power was impossible. Black-owned towns were impossible. Desegregation was impossible. Every time the country said never, black people made it happen. Reparation isn't the wall. It's just the next step. It's a policy choice, not a miracle. When black people move, the impossible moves with us. Now, here's the part people don't want to say out loud, but history has already answered this question for us. If you really want to know whether reparations are impossible, you have to look at what black people have already done in a country built to stop them, because impossible has shown up before, and every time, black people buried it. They said ending slavery was impossible, then enslaved people walked off the plantation, built free communities, and forced the Union to rewrite war itself. They said black soldiers could never fight. Black regiments stormed forts, flipped battles, and pulled the nation back from defeat. They said black literacy was impossible. 3 years after the war, thousands of schools existed, built by black families with nothing but determination and a roof. They said black political power was impossible. Then black lawmakers rewrote constitutions and walked into Congress, taking seats once owned by Confederates. They said black towns, black banks, black businesses were impossible. Black communities built entire economies that stunned the country. They said desegregation was impossible. Black children, parents, pastors, students, workers, and lawyers forced the nation to obey its own constitution. Every time America said never, black people answered with watch us. Impossible is a story this country tells when it doesn't want to change, but impossible has never survived black action. So, is reparations impossible? No. It's not even the hardest thing black communities have accomplished. It's not a miracle. It is a policy choice. One America has avoided, delayed, and dodged, but never disproven. The truth is simple. When black people move, the impossible moves with us. The only question left is, when do we push? This country has never handed black people anything without a fight. Not freedom, not literacy, not voting, not safety, not dignity, even today. And it will not hand over reparations without resistance either. America has a long history of saying no first, and finding its courage only after black people force the door open. And yes, this nation will delay, distort, sabotage, distract, divide, and demonize. It always has. That's not new. It's the pattern. But here's the part we forget. We never needed permission to win. Harriet Tubman didn't wait for permission. The 54th Massachusetts didn't wait for permission. Black teachers didn't wait for permission. Black towns didn't wait for permission. The Little Rock Nine didn't wait for permission. They moved first, and history adjusted. That is our lineage. So how do we stay encouraged when the battle gets loud? You remember who you come from. You remember the victories built by people who had less than you have now. You remember that every never in American history ends the same way, with a black community making never irrelevant. The fight isn't about possibility. It's about pressure. It's about strategy. It's about memory. The memory of everything you've already overcome. My grandfather used to say, power is in knowledge. And he was right. Once you understand what black people have already defeated, once you really see it, you stop asking, is it possible? And you start asking a better question. Who's afraid of what comes next? Because it is not us. If you're still here, thank you for hanging out this long. Please hit the like and subscribe button and click on the notification bell so that I can bring you more content like this.